For my refutation speech, I have Jocelyn Carlos, and her main claim was that seawater desalination is a practical alternative to a consistent, sustainable fresh water in California. Her first claim is that desalination plants have the ability to create water out of the largest source on Earth. And she states that water covers about 75% of the planet, but that is basically irrelevant. And then most desalination plants nowadays are done by modern reverse osmosis, such as the one that is going to be put in Carlsbad, California. And then these seawater desalination plants take in large volumes of water. And a simple, quick ratio for how much water is being taken in out in these plants just to put out fresh water is for every 2 gallons that are pumped out or taken in of seawater, only 1 gallon is put out of fresh water. And then the process of seawater would be for it to pass through fine pored membranes to separate the fresh water from the salt, and then the highly concentrated salt is then disposed back into the ocean. And then fish and other marine organisms are killed on the intake streams. So with the intake streams, it's basically like a vacuum, and with all the small things such as plankton, fish eggs, larvae are all being sucked into the water intake screens, and then they're killed during the process of desalination, to taking away out the salt from the water. Excuse me. And their second claim is the technology used in desalination plants is advancing more every day to create more cost-effective water. I did my own research, and this is completely untrue, because just according to Michael Hiltzik from the LA Times in his article, desalination plants aren't a good solution for the California drought. He reports that the project for the desalination plant or seawater plant in Carlsbad, California, is going to cost around $1 billion and is still not operational today. It is going to start operating in late this year or early next year. This plant in Carlsbad, California is the largest of its kind in the U.S. and is going to provide San Diego with 50 million gallons of water, which is about 7% of its water needs. And just with that plant, it's not covering all of California or even Los Angeles County. It's just San Diego County, and with only the 50 million gallons, it's only 7% of its water needs. Heather Cooley, a water program director at the Oakland-based environmental think tank of the Pacific Institute, says seawater desalination is a reliable supply independent of weather conditions like drought, but it's still among the most expensive water supply options. The plant in Carlsbad, California, is being built by Poseidon Water, a private company, and will be paid in large part by rate increases on San Diego County water customers. So what this company is going to do is raise the prices of water bills in the San Diego County just to pay for the water that they're doing and to operate the plant. And then Santa Cruz and five other Northern California water districts have looked and thought of the idea to build and start their own seawater desalination plant, but have backed off the idea because of its expensive and environmental implications. So her last supporting claim is desalination plants are being successfully used in other parts of the world. She mainly uses the idea of the desalination plant in Saudi Arabia, and it's one of the best ones that are out there. But what about the rest of the world, such as India? And then for Australia, which after 2006 invested more than $12 billion in 6 desalination plants, and the largest of them was twice the size of the Carlsbad plant that is being built right now, and then was eventually stopped, and then shut down three other of them, four in total in 2012, after eventually the rain started falling in Australia. And so with her argument is invalid. She did not present all of the evidence that was needed to convince me that the desalination plants were the best option for fresh water in California.
All right, double dipping on the ocean again. The argument about whether or not they work, you basically say it's reverse osmosis. I don't know that there's much dispute about that. You talk about it being a large volume of water. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to work. And in fact, you say, well, the whole argument about it being, how much ocean water there is not relevant. I think that's why it's relevant, because we've got so much ocean available that it doesn't matter if we only get half as much water out as we put in. We've got more than enough to put in to get the water that we need. So I think you're not getting much with that particular point. The problem with the intake is mostly asserted. I think there's probably evidence there. I'm sure you got this information from someplace, but it's not being cited in your presentation, and I think that that's a little bit problematic. On the second argument on cost issues, well, you basically say it's untrue. I don't know if untrue is the right term that you want to be using here. I do think there's an argument about it being costly. And now the question is, what is the cost that is appropriate or reasonable? At the end of your argument, you suggest that Australia has tried to do this and it became cost ineffective when the rains came back, and therefore it wasn't really competitive anymore. I think we had the same experience in Santa Barbara a few years ago, where they attempted to, they actually built the plant, but they couldn't afford to keep it running because water was so readily available in other places. I don't know if it's running again now or not. That would have been one of those things that would have been an interesting example to use on that particular point. There's not a challenge about whether or not the supply is reliable, but really about what the cost is. And your only argument here is that it's going to be paid for by rate increases. So that's basically how all infrastructure gets paid for. So there's some kind of rate increase, whether it is for electricity, whether it is for roads, and you pay it in tax revenues by highway fees, that sort of thing, or for water issues. So I'm not sure why that's a problem, unless you can show, for instance, that it would be a substantial burden for the public to assume that. For example, if suddenly the water rates were going to be twice as high, then I think there's a good argument to be made on this. But I don't really get any comparative data on that point. On the Saudi Arabian example, there's not much discussion of it, except that you say, well, what about the other places in the world? And I think that the Australian example is a good one. Again, I think you need to be citing some sources on these particular points. But the idea here is that whenever water becomes available again, it suddenly makes the investment unproductive, it makes it counterproductive, or it makes it costs us more to utilize that. I think that's the argument that you might want to work on a little bit, and say that maybe our drought issues are not long-term, that there's going to be alternatives. There's not really much discussion of the alternatives, except that there's this vague reference of environmental issues to the desalinization, but I didn't really hear what other alternative. Why aren't we hearing about conservation issues? Why aren't we hearing about other ways to reclaim water and reuse water? I think that those would be some good counterpoints on this point, and just some opportunities missed here. All right, thank you.